Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, we also share with so many of you in the United Kingdom.
At exactly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, King Charles III was seconds away from signing a document that would have fundamentally altered the financial future of the British monarchy. He was sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany table inside the Privy Council chamber at Buckingham Palace. The room was absolutely silent. The gold fountain pen was literally hovering over the thick parchment. Camilla stood quietly in the background, her posture projecting complete victory. She had spent months orchestrating this exact moment, maneuvering through palace back channels to secure a massive transfer of royal assets into her own family's commercial portfolio. But before the ink could touch the page, the heavy double doors of the chamber opened by the master of the rolls. One of the most senior judges in the British legal system walked into the room unannounced. He was not carrying a tablet or a standard government briefing. He was carrying a single-aged leather folder, and sealed across the flap was a thick block of red wax bearing the royal cipher of Queen Elizabeth II. Everyone in that room, including the King of England, thought the late Queen's will had been completely settled and locked away in the royal vaults back in 2022. They believed the financial transition was over. They were completely wrong, because what Queen Elizabeth had actually done before she died was lay a legal trap so perfectly constructed, so devastatingly precise, that it was about to destroy Camilla's entire master plan in front of the highest legal officials in the country. To understand the absolute genius of the weapon that the Chief Justice had just carried into that room, you have to understand a secret legal mechanism known as a testamentary veto. For decades, the public has been told that when a monarch dies, their private estates, specifically Balmoral Castle in Scotland and Sandringham House in Norfolk, pass directly and completely to the next sovereign. They are not managed by the government. They are not part of the Crown estate. They are private family homes worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and Charles believed that as king he now held absolute unchecked authority to do whatever he wanted with them. But Queen Elizabeth reigned for 70 years. She did not survive world wars, economic collapses, and 14 prime ministers by being naive. She possessed a terrifying understanding of human nature, and she saw exactly where the greatest threat to her family's legacy would come from. She had watched Camilla's ambition evolve over the decades. She knew that her son Charles was emotionally dependent, physically tiring, and highly susceptible to his wife's quiet, relentless pressure. Elizabeth knew that once she was gone, Camilla would eventually try to strip the generational wealth of the Windsor bloodline to build an empire for her own children. So, working in absolute secrecy with top constitutional lawyers in the final years of her life, the Queen drafted a sovereign codicil. It was a delayed activation clause attached to the deeds of her private estates. She did not leave Balmoral to Charles as a permanent, unconditional gift. She left it to him under the strict legal definition of a custodian. The land was his to use, his to enjoy, and his to maintain. But Elizabeth had buried a legal landmine in the paperwork, a set of invisible boundaries that, if crossed, would instantly trigger a catastrophic financial reset. For 3 years, that red wax envelope sat in the dark, waiting. It only required one specific trigger to be opened. It required Charles to attempt to give a piece of the Windsor inheritance to someone outside the bloodline, and Camilla, blinded by her own greed, pushed her husband directly onto that landmine. The target she chose was not just any piece of land. It was Craigowan Lodge. Nestled deep within the Balmoral estate, this rustic 7-bedroom stone house was arguably the most sacred piece of property in Queen Elizabeth's entire life. It was her absolute sanctuary. It was where she spent her final days, surrounded by the quiet Scottish Highlands, far away from the cameras and the courtiers. It was a place of profound historical and emotional gravity for the Windsor family. But when Camilla looked at Craigowan Lodge, she did not see history. She saw a profoundly lucrative commercial opportunity. Over the past 8 months, Camilla had been quietly working with her son, Tom Parker Bowles, to draft a highly speculative business proposal. They wanted to rip out the historical interior of the lodge and transform it into an ultra-luxury, invite-only eco-resort targeting foreign billionaires and elite corporate syndicates. The pitch deck that Tom Parker Bowles had prepared was staggering in its audacity. It featured Michelin star tasting menus, private hunting expeditions, and wellness retreats, all operating under the prestigious umbrella of the royal brand. Camilla was attempting to take the very house where the longest reigning monarch in British history took her final breaths and turn it into a commercial hospitality cash cow. With the management contracts and the profit shares funneled directly into a holding company controlled by her son, she was not just trying to steal a property. She was actively trying to erase Queen Elizabeth's memory and pave over it with a Parker Bowles commercial enterprise. To execute this, she needed Charles to sign a permanent commercial lease agreement, detaching Craigowan Lodge from the protected Balmoral Trust and handing it over to the new private holding company. The psychological pressure she applied to Charles behind closed doors was reportedly relentless. She framed the project as a necessary modernization of royal assets. She argued that the estates were draining money and needed to become self-sufficient. She wore him down day after day, week after week, capitalizing on his fatigue and his deep aversion to domestic conflict. And her manipulation worked. Charles, frail, exhausted, and desperately wanting peace within his own household, finally caved. He agreed to sign the commercial lease. He agreed to surrender his mother's sanctuary to his stepson. That brings us back to the exact moment in the Privy Council chamber. The documents were printed on heavy vellum. The lawyers were assembled. Camilla was standing just a few feet away, watching the gold pen hover over the signature line. She had won. She had successfully bypassed Prince William, outmaneuvered the palace traditionalists, and secured a multi-million-pound asset for her own bloodline. The commercialization of the British monarchy was about to begin under her direct command. But as Charles lowered the pen to make the first stroke of his signature, the master of the rolls stepped forward, placing his hand flat on the table, legally halting the proceeding. The entire room stopped breathing. The Chief Justice did not look at Camilla. He did not ask for permission. He simply placed the leather folder on the polished wood, looked the King of England dead in the eye, and announced that the conditions of a delayed sovereign codicil had just been triggered. The red wax seal was about to be broken. The master of the rolls broke the seal. The sharp sound of the cracking red wax echoed through the silent chamber like a gunshot. He did not hesitate. He opened the leather folder, pulled out the document written in Queen Elizabeth's own hand, and began to read the terms of the sovereign codicil aloud to the assembled members of the Privy Council. The legal clause was a masterpiece of institutional warfare. It was designed with a single brutal objective: to ensure that the private estates of the House of Windsor could never be chipped away, commercialized, or exploited by anyone who married into the family. The text stated in absolute unambiguous legal terms that Balmoral Castle and all its surrounding lands, including Craigowan Lodge, were held by the sovereign on one strict condition: the preservation of historical integrity. Then came the clause that completely destroyed Camilla's ambition. The Queen had written that if the reigning monarch ever attempted to lease, sell, or transfer any portion of these private estates to a commercial entity or to any individual outside the direct royal bloodline, the ownership structure would immediately default. The entire Balmoral estate, valued at over £140 million, would instantly be stripped from Charles's personal possession and transferred in full title and absolute ownership to the heir apparent. To Prince William. Effective the exact second the pen touched the paper. The room went completely cold. Charles stared at the document, his hand frozen. The gold fountain pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany table. He realized with a wave of absolute panic the terrifying trap his mother had laid for him. If he signed Camilla's lease agreement to turn Craigowan Lodge into a luxury resort, he wouldn't just be giving his stepson a business. He would be losing Balmoral Castle. He would be stripped of his own inheritance. I would become a mere tenant in the very home he was currently ruling over, while his son William became the legal landlord. Camilla stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She looked at the king, silently begging him to find a loophole to override the codicil to assert his sovereign authority. But Charles knew there was no loophole. A deceased monarch's private will, when structured through a sovereign trust, is completely unassailable under British law. Not even the king can rewrite a trust established by the previous sovereign to protect the crown's private assets. In front of the highest legal officials in the country, the king was forced to make his choice. It was the ultimate humiliating betrayal of his wife's ambitions. Charles reached across the table, picked up the commercial lease agreement that Camilla and Tom Parker Bowles had spent months preparing, and slowly ripped it in half. He did not look at Camilla. He could not bring himself to meet her gaze. He simply looked at the floor and ordered the Privy Council session to be adjourned immediately. Camilla was left standing in the center of the chamber, completely ruined. The illusion of her absolute influence over the king had just evaporated in front of a room full of courtiers, judges, and advisers. She had spent 2 decades engineering her way to the top of the institution, believing that once Charles wore the crown, her family's financial future would be secure. Instead, she had just been completely outmaneuvered by a dead woman. By that evening, the palace press office was already scrambling to manage the narrative. The public story released to the media was framed as a moment of profound, selfless leadership. The headlines on the front pages of the London newspapers the next morning read that King Charles had shocked the nation by personally vetoing a major commercial development at Balmoral to preserve the historical legacy of his late mother. The public praised him for his restraint, for his dedication to heritage, and for his quiet dignity. But inside the palace walls, everyone knew the truth. They knew that Charles had not acted out of restraint. He had been forced into submission. He had been cornered by a legal system built by a queen who had outsmarted him from beyond the grave. And standing at the back of the room, throughout that entire ordeal, completely unnoticed by the cameras, was Prince William. He did not say a word. He did not need to, because William was the one who had quietly alerted the Master of the Rolls to the existence of the sovereign codicil 48 hours earlier. He knew exactly what was in his grandmother's will. He knew the legal trap was there, and he had waited until the absolute last second, until Camilla believed she was victorious, before triggering the mechanism. The power dynamic within the royal family had shifted permanently. Camilla had spent 30 years believing that the only obstacle between her and absolute security was the public's memory of Diana. She now realized that she was fighting a far more dangerous adversary. She was fighting a ghost. She was a tenant in a house owned by a sovereign who had coded the future to protect her heirs from the very woman who had infiltrated her family. What Camilla's daily life looks like now is the reality of a complete and total defeat. The commercial proposals are dead. Her son's luxury hospitality brand has been completely shut down before it could even launch, leaving Tom Parker Bowles facing millions of pounds in lost speculative investments. The Parker Bowles family's access to the private royal estates has been quietly but systematically restricted, with security staff at Balmoral and Sandringham receiving updated directives that require advanced clearance from William's office for any non-blood relatives. But the deepest fear now circulating within Camilla's inner circle is the realization that this sovereign codicil was only the first envelope. Queen Elizabeth thus ruled for 70 years, and she left behind dozens of sealed trusts, private diaries, and confidential archives, all protected by the same legal genius. The question that keeps Camilla awake at night is not whether she can win the next fight. It is how many other legal landmines are buried beneath her feet, waiting for her to take one wrong step. Prince William has returned to Adelaide Cottage, his quiet focus unchanged. He did not celebrate the victory. He simply watched the personal standard of the king fly over a Balmoral estate that Charles only holds on paper. The message to the palace, to the courtiers, and to Camilla was delivered in total silence. The crown belongs to those who have the patience to protect it. And for the woman who tried to commercialize the legacy of the House of Windsor, the game is officially over.